It's the Rock and Roll Whiskey Show. Now here's your host, Mark Dauner.
Today and Saturday, Friday, December 1st and 2nd, 2023, the band Kiss will play their final shows at New York's Madison Square Garden in the city where they began 50 years ago. Now, I'm not an original Kiss fan. I was born in the year that Destroyer and Rock and Roll Over, Kiss's fourth and fifth studio albums, came out, 1976. So I missed out on most of 70s Kiss mania, save for a segment on the kids' show 321 Contact, which I saw at age 4 or 5, I think. And that may have planted a seed in my mind that would sprout a decade or so later. I saw their makeup, I saw their stage show, I saw one of the hosts talking through a mic that modulated her voice. It was cool, and I always remembered that since I was probably 4 or 5 years old. But it wasn't until around 88 or 89 that I really started to listen to Kiss. I bought the Smashes, Thrashes, and Hits Greatest Hits album as part of a Columbia House order. If you're old enough, you may remember those record clubs, Columbia House and BMG. Pretty sure this one was Columbia. And I wasn't supposed to make those orders as a minor, but I did. I did that 2 or 3 times, honestly. And on this one, Smashes, Thrashes, and Hits was one of the cassettes that I got in my 8 for a penny or whatever it was. And I wore that tape out, listening to Detroit Rock City, Deuce, Tears Are Falling, Heaven's on Fire, Shout It Out Loud, I Love It Loud, Lick It Up, Rock and Roll All Night, and many more. The first time I heard Beth, in fact, was on that album, and it was sung by Eric Carr, not Peter Criss. But it was a series of events in 89 and 90 that solidified my fandom in Kiss and made me a permanent member of the Kiss Army. Unofficial member. I never paid anything to them, joined the club, but I'm definitely a unofficial member. First, the album Hot in the Shade came out in 89. Now, many Kiss fans, particularly the older ones, aren't big fans of that record. But for 13-year-old me, it was perfect. The cover featured a Sphinx wearing sunglasses. Like something that fit right in with the aesthetic of the late 80s. And it also featured big rockin' songs with aggressive lyrics and some sexual innuendo that I'm sure I found hilarious and something I was quote-unquote getting away with as I spun that record on my Magnavox stereo at age 13. Now, I did own that on vinyl, and I'm a huge vinyl fan now, but at the time records were on their way out in favor of the cassette and the CD, but they were still pressing records, and they were a little cheaper. They weren't as in demand. So a lot of the records from that time, a lot of albums from that time, I bought on vinyl. Still have many of them. And I bought my copy of Hot in the Shade at Pickles Records and Tapes in Millard, Nebraska, which is a suburban part of Omaha. And sadly, I didn't care for my records that well back then, and that record's cracked. I've still got the record in a frame in my basement and have since replaced it with a new copy. But I loved that record, and I still do. A few months later, after that album came out, Kiss announced that they were going to perform at the Omaha Civic Auditorium, May 10th, 1990. At this time, I was 13 still, almost 14, and hadn't been to a concert, save for a couple of country concerts that I went to with my parents and a very strange show by the Miami Sound Machine in a little amphitheater at a county fair just before they broke and Gloria Estefan became a superstar. But I really count the Kiss show as my first concert because that was the first arena show that I ever went to. And I went with my friends, Tim and Matt, and my dad, who had come also because I was too young and couldn't drive. My dad didn't like it, but we did. We sat near the top of the auditorium and watched the new band at the time, Slaughter, perform on their first tour. Matt and I even got to meet Mark Slaughter and Dana Strum that day down by the soundboard in the arena. I got them to sign my wrinkled library card because I didn't have anything else for them to sign. Matt gave them some nachos. Then Faster Pussycat came on. Now, this band has some history in Omaha. The previous year when they had opened for Motley Crue on their Dr. Feelgood tour, the Faster Pussycat drummer at the time got arrested for FedEx and himself drugs. Can't remember if it was cocaine or heroin, but whatever it was, it got him in trouble. So they had a new drummer on this Kiss tour, and they came out and gave a performance that you really shouldn't watch with a parent. On one song, they came out in what I guess was an homage to Public Enemy and started to rap, at least one of them having a toilet seat hanging around their neck with rather than a big clock. But awkwardness aside, I loved it all. And even though they're really not the greatest band ever, Faster Pussycat's still a lot of fun to watch. And I always go see them when they come through town on tour. And they come a lot, actually. Then came Kiss, though. It was time. The lights went down. These chromatic ancient Egyptian tones started to blast through the PA. The Sphinx appeared that was on the album cover. Lasers shot out into the arena. Smoke on the stage. Something that's pretty common now, but in 1990 blew my 13-year-old mind. And the band, Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Bruce Kulick, and Eric Carr, appeared in the middle of the stage in kind of a silhouette. I was hooked. They opened with I Stole Your Love, a song that I don't think I'd heard yet. I can't quite recall when I bought Alive 2. It was around this time. That was my first Kiss Live record. But I know I didn't have Love Gun yet, and I don't think I knew that song. But I loved it. They proceeded to run through all kinds of their hits from their 70s songs, Detroit Rock City and Deuce and Love Gun and everything else, and their 80s pop metal hits, and of course music from Hot in the Shade as well. And then, of course, Kiss, not to be outdone by Faster Pussycat, was not without their share of sexual innuendo. Paul Stanley, infamous for his strange and interesting raps between songs. The vodka and orange juice one from Alive being his most strange one that people quote all the time.
I was talking to somebody backstage before, and they would tell me there's a lot of you people there that like to drink vodka and orange juice.
Then, of course, there's this gem from Alive 3 right before the song Take It Off.
How many of you guys like to look at naked women? Let me hear ya!
This particular one from the Hot in the Shade tour, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was at that point in my life where I realized what lick it up might actually mean. Awkward when your dad's sitting a couple seats from you. And then there came time for the drum solo. Now, I don't really like drum solos very much anymore. I ate them up as a teenager, but I'm kind of over them. Unless that drummer's truly great or does something really entertaining. You might see like a Zoltan Chaney who's played with Slaughter and Vince Neil, or R.J. Hale from Hailstorm with his big drumsticks and marching band toms and everything else he's done over the years. But otherwise, a standard drum solo I can really do without them. I know they're mainly to give the rest of the band a little break in the middle of the show, but I could go without. But that's beside the point, because Eric Carr's solo that night, drummer for Kiss since about 1980 or so, it blew my mind. The drumming was, of course, great. He was a fantastic drummer. And the lasers in the stage show were great as well during that part. He had electronic drums and triggers that made all these crazy, unique sounds, something that's now pretty typical and normal for a drummer, but a revelation to me in 1990. Loved it. And that whole show was so great that when we went to see Kiss again when they came back to nearby Lincoln, Nebraska, about 5 months later, this time with Winger and Vixen, my friend Tim's dad took us to that concert. He liked it just as little as my dad did, and he still talks about it quite a bit. The rest is history. I got to see Kiss many times after that, including twice on their reunion tour with Ace Frehley and Peter Criss, the tour where they put their makeup back on. Saw them on their Psycho Circus tour that featured a 3D glasses component. Big gimmick. I still have those glasses somewhere. I saw them co-headline with Aerosmith. I saw them co-headline with Def Leppard. Saw them on their first farewell tour back like almost 20 years ago now. Didn't take. Saw them in a club in Sioux Falls about 7 or 8 years ago, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, playing an unplugged show for charity. That's actually one of my favorite Kiss memories. And then I saw them 3 times on their End of the Road tour, twice in 2019 in Sioux Falls, South Dakota and Omaha, and then once in February 2020, right before the pandemic started, which is, I think, why the tour is still going right now. It would have been wrapped up maybe at least a year earlier than this. But now we've come to the conclusion. Kiss plays their last 2 shows here tonight, Friday as I record this, December 1st, and Saturday night, December 2nd in New York City. And will Kiss continue on after that in some way? I would think so. Now, Gene and Paul say this will absolutely be the end of the band as a makeup-wearing touring act. And that's understandable. They're into their mid-70s, and it's a heck of a lot of work to put all that makeup and all the heavy costuming on and do all these really crazy stage antics. But will we see Gene out there with his solo band? Will we see Paul with his band or other projects? I'd say definitely. Will we see them collaborating together? I don't know. It's hard to say. Will there be countless more compilations and releases of past live shows for fans to buy in the future? They've been releasing like live soundboard albums over the last few years, and they're really fun. Not the greatest quality, but it's great to hear all these different eras and shows from Kiss over the years. I love it all. I don't buy everything, that they put out anymore because there's just so much of it. But I do love that it's there. So this week, to commemorate not only the conclusion of nearly 50 years as the hottest band in the world, as they have named themselves, I guess, but also to commemorate the beginning of my Kiss fandom. So I want to get into Hot in the Shade just a little bit. Before we do that, though, I want to pour a whiskey. And I've chosen a whiskey that I think fits pretty well. It's a commercially successful, strong, powerful whiskey that's gained a certain reputation over the years. But when you look a little deeper into it, you find some really great things about it. I'm talking about Wild Turkey 101. Now, Wild Turkey is among my favorite go-to whiskeys for taking to a party or a football tailgate. It's got a good flavor and it's economical. Is it the best bourbon? No, it's not. Do a lot of people hate it because they had a bad experience with it when they were younger taking shots? Yes. And I also find that people tend to conflate that with Bacardi 151 just because they both have a number in their name, which is silly, but whatever. Have I gone on to drink more rich, more complex, and more nuanced whiskey over time? Absolutely. But through all of that, Wild Turkey stands up pretty well. It's good as a mixer with that 101 proof standing up to ice or soda or a Coke. Even in an old-fashioned, although I tend to prefer a rye with that extra little bit of spice in it for a old-fashioned. It's even got enough of your typical bourbon sweetness and caramel palate that pretty damn good neat as well. Unlike Kiss, Wild Turkey was not my first bourbon, but it was one of the first bourbons that I tried and really enjoyed. It had a little complexity, but was still very accessible. I found flavors in the whiskey that I hadn't noticed on other whiskeys before. Almost entertaining, if a whiskey can be entertaining, and I think that it can. It truly got me into bourbon, and I should add here, just to future-proof this, that I had a similar experience with Evan Williams' Black Label. If I say a similar thing about that, don't call me out. Pairing Kiss with Wild Turkey 101 is, I think, pretty fitting. 101 is known for its bold and spicy profile with hints of sweetness. It mirrors the blend of hard rock and melody that Kiss has become known for. The bourbon's robust character complements the energetic live show, but there's more to it than what's found on the label or found in its reputation. When you look deeper, it's got a pedigree, it's got influence, it's got history, it's got some nuance to it. Is there more nuance when you get into Wild Turkey's other offerings like Rare Breed, which is really one of my favorites, or Russell's Reserve whiskeys? Absolutely. But 101's a great whiskey that you can find just about any bar or liquor store for a pretty reasonable price. And that's why I've paired Wild Turkey 101 with Kiss this week, and in particular, Hot in the Shade. So let's talk about that one now. I'm not going to go through every track on this record because it's a pretty long record, about an hour. Despite the problems with this record, there are moments that are truly Kiss. This was a record that saw Gene starting to come back into the Kiss fold a little more. He'd been dividing his focus between the band and other pursuits like acting and Shannon Tweed. And it was evident his contributions to previous albums, Asylum and Crazy Nights, were lacking. And they'll tell you about it. Gene will even tell you about that. And while I do like some of the things on those records, particularly Bruce Kulick's leads, he had joined the band right before Asylum. And of course, there's some catchy Paul Stanley-led numbers. He was the mainstay through all of the 80s. In general, those records don't stand up to the rest of the catalog. Hot in the Shade was, though, a first step towards righting that ship, which would culminate in their reunion with producer Bob Ezrin for the Great Revenge album in 1992, and eventually would lead to their reunion with the original band, bringing Ace Frehley and Peter Criss back into the fold and getting themselves propelled back into the mainstream, at least on some level. And that's where we are today. All started with Hot in the Shade. It was a pivotal moment, I think. Now, your best songs on Hot in the Shade, they tend to be the singles on this record, I think. Rise to It's a good Kiss song with great guitar work from Stanley and Kulick and fun slide guitar opening. It's pretty nice. Hide Your Heart's also an interesting tune. You could call it a ballad, not in the sense that it's a slow song. It's upbeat, actually, but it's a song that tells a story. In fact, it's kind of a West Side Story inspired type theme. It was penned by Paul Stanley in collaboration with Desmond Child and Holly Knight, two songwriters that had a hand in many of the big songs of the 80s and into the 90s, actually. Bonnie Tyler actually even recorded this song. Apparently she needed another song about doing something to a heart. Think about that one for a minute. Ace Frehley recorded the song as well, strangely. He released it on his album Trouble Walkin' like 4 days before Hot in the Shade came out. It's not great. And actually, Trouble Walking not great in its entirety, but Ace is Ace. Southern rockers Molly Hatchet also recorded this song. That one, I listened to it yesterday preparing for this episode. It's bad. So actually, I think the Kiss version of Hide Your Heart is probably the best, and it's the one I'm most familiar with. It's got a really nice guitar lead from Kulick, and it's got all the signature Paul Stanley tropes with yas and ohs, and kind of Paul at his best, if you like that kind of thing. And I do. So Hide Your Heart's there. Forever. We can't do this one without talking about Forever. It's a sappy love ballad penned by Paul Stanley along with Michael Bolton. Gives you a little idea where we might be going with this. But it's a good, listenable, late 80s power ballad. Features a nice acoustic solo by Kulick, which sets it apart a bit from your Every Rose Has Its Thorns and your Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone's and your, you know, all the ballads from that era. But it's a good song. I always liked Little Caesar too. And that one, I think I like it because it is sung by Eric Carr, which is a nice moment for him. Now, Eric Carr, we talked about his drum solo on the Hot in the Shade tour earlier, which I loved. He was one of my favorite members of Kiss, without a doubt. And he sadly died of cancer in November 1991, actually on the day that Freddie Mercury passed away, which kind of overshadowed Eric's death outside of Kiss fandom, unfortunately. But sad day. So every moment we got that featured Eric was really welcomed in hindsight. And we've gotten a few over the years, and I really appreciate that. The record closes with a tune called Boomerang, which, fast and heavy, reminds me a little of Motorhead's Overkill, actually, in terms of the drums and pounding bass line. It's a lot of fun, and I think propels them into what would happen on Revenge. And there are a lot of other good songs on this album, and also a few clunkers. It's 58 minutes long, and probably would have been better at around 45 minutes, but that was this era, really. Everybody wanted to put out as much as they could on the new longer format CD. Wasn't always a good idea. Got worse as we got into the 90s. A lot of filler on albums, just so they could get to the set what would eventually be like 74, 75 minutes. Some bad decisions made on albums from that era. But that's not this one. Hot in the Shade's an album that I love, and I probably love it, honestly, because it hit me at the right time when I was getting into rock and roll. All this late 80s Kiss along with Hysteria era Def Leppard, Slippery When Wet and New Jersey era Bon Jovi, OU812 era Van Halen, Skid Row, Tesla, Warrant, all those others. Those were the bands that got me into rock and roll. Then I went from there, branching out into heavier music, Metallica, Anthrax, Judas Priest, Maiden, getting into Southern rock with Skynyrd and the Allman Brothers Band, into 70s glam a little more. Kiss was a part of that, but so was David Bowie and Alice Cooper. And so many other directions, to the point where I now have a really hard time figuring out who my favorite band is or what my favorite genre of rock is. I have so many. But Kiss is always there. No matter how deep I get into 70s prog rock epics, see the last episode, I can always put on a Kiss record and have a great time. And I know their catalog more completely and thoroughly than I know any other band's catalog. It's always there for me if I need it. I toyed with going to the show at Madison Square Garden this weekend. I could have got a seat for about $500 in that arena, and I thought about it, but the airfares in New York City on short notice were higher than I could justify. I'm going to enjoy all my memories of seeing Kiss live. I bought the pay-per-view that's happening Saturday night, and I'll watch that in my garage on the projector screen. Should be a lot of fun. What are you going to do? I invite you to get out your bottle of Wild Turkey 101 this weekend, or whenever you hear this, and raise your glass to one of the great spectacles and the greatest bands in rock history as we say goodnight for the last time to the hottest band in the world, Kiss.
Another episode of the Rock and Roll Whiskey Show will be here soon. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Overcast, YouTube, or whatever player you prefer. You can get show notes as well as tasting notes for the featured music and whiskey at rockandrollreclaimed.com. You can also get links to Mark's social media channels at the website. The Rock and Roll Whiskey Show is a production of Rock and Roll Reclaimed. Goodbye.